Is it curtains for Prime Minister Boris Johnson as the repercussions play out over some home decorating? Joe Biden announces a return to big government in his State of the Union speech, and India suffers the worst COVID-19 chaos we've seen while the government tries to censor its critics. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. In the UK, satisfaction with the government's pandemic performance has largely gone up due to the widely celebrated success of the vaccine programme. Recent polls have put the governing Conservative Party significantly ahead of the opposition at a crucial point, with local elections taking place next week. Indeed, it seems as though even the push for Scottish independence may have been repelled. Polls are now showing a decline in support for the SNP and for independence, partly explained by the realisation by Scots that their vaccination status would have been very different in the independent scenario. So things are looking pretty good for the government. And yet there is a non-zero chance that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is going to be brought down because of an argument about home decoration. It's been called Wallpapergate and the cash for cushions scandal. Now, generally, my interest in politics is in the bigger questions, the what should be done questions about the important issues, as well as the how does power work questions. I have so little interest in the gossip aspect of politics, which minister's going to get fired because he slept with someone he shouldn't have, who's stabbing who in the back because they're jealous or because of political rivalry or whatever. It's the stuff of mainstream coverage. The political journalists live in the political bubble with all the other political people, and they all think these things are utterly fascinating and utterly crucial, and I disagree. So I've been trying to ignore the wallpaper row because it's stupid. But stupid can have consequences, and there's always a bigger underlying story to be unveiled. So let's do our best with this one. Here's the short version. Boris Johnson is a man with a number of assets and a number of extremely well-documented flaws. As one MP was quoted anonymously as saying, "When we voted for Boris, we knew that we would have to take the rough with the smooth. But it would be good if there was a bit more smooth." In the first part of his premiership, he worked extremely well with his advisor, Dominic Cummings, who gave the intellectual rigour and the sense of direction that Boris Johnson himself lacks. Then it all fell apart, and like a great Shakespearean tragedy, it did so because of the character flaws of the protagonists. One important factor was this: in the UK, unlike the US, there is no office of the First Lady. I don't know why the US has got it, to be honest. For a country that hates monarchy and embraces democracy, it seems rather monarchical. But anyway, the spouses, wives and husbands of prime ministers, have often been strong people in their own right, but the convention has always been followed that they work assiduously not to influence politics where they have no kind of legitimate mandate. Johnson's fiancée, Carrie Symonds, has broken that mould. She was politically involved in her former life. She now takes a very direct and personal interest in who gets hired and to do what, and those sorts of questions. And that's why Dominic Cummings was eventually ejected from his position. Her defenders say that her critics are just sensitive older men who can't cope with the idea of a strong, powerful woman, which is the language of the playground that passes for politics these days in the country that elected Margaret Thatcher, for goodness sake. So, no. The point is that whatever Carrie Symonds' political virtues may or may not be, they are not, as Douglas Murray tartly remarked in this week's Spectator, they are not why she is sleeping at number 10 Downing Street. We expect the people who wield power to be accountable. So political spouses, they can provide support, not direction. Now, ironically, it's not her political meddling that has caused the current problem. She decided that they should redecorate the flat that they live in at number 10, which is not political, you'd think. It turns out she has expensive tastes. Reportedly, Persian rugs, cream walls with gold hangings and gold chandeliers are involved. £800 a roll wallpaper and all of that. And now there's a row about whether a party supporter was asked to pay for the renovation with a donation and whether this was properly declared. Now, it's a stupid detail, but nevertheless it's one there because of an important principle, which is that office holders should be held to a high standard and donations that could influence policy-making preferences should be properly declared. Johnson has a history of being careless and uninterested in such boring administration details. Dominic Cummings has said that when he was asked his opinion on the flat redecoration proposal, he told him in no uncertain terms that it was wrong and potentially illegal. For whatever reason, and it's hard to fathom, to be honest, Boris Johnson decided to pick a fight with his former advisor last week by briefing the press that Dominic Cummings had been responsible for a damaging leak about the second COVID lockdown. By all accounts, this wasn't a calculated move. It was Johnson lashing out in frustration. You know, like kicking a sleeping bear because you're having a bad day. What could possibly go wrong? Cummings immediately responded with a rebuttal, made clear he was willing to testify to a forthcoming House of Commons committee and answer any and all questions for as long as they want. And that's going to take place on May the 26th. It's clearly marked out as the day Cummings will lay bare the worst of what he's seen. Although the committee's Conservative controlled, they will probably try to limit the focus to their specific inquiry on the pandemic and limit the damage. The worst of that might be, in Cummings' view, that Johnson's rejection of the case for a second lockdown cost thousands of lives. Which will be bad, but it will be the wallpaper that does for him. There are 3 investigations now in train. The Electoral Commission, looking at whether the Conservative Party received a donation from Lord Brownlow for the refurbishment, should have been declared and wasn't. The Parliamentary Standards investigation, looking at whether Boris Johnson failed to declare initial donations for the flat. The fact Johnson has since covered the cost himself doesn't change the question about who paid initially. And then there's the Geit review, ordered by the Prime Minister himself, looking at whether any donations were declared as they should have been. The key tipping point for any of these is the question not whether the rules were broken, because almost certainly they were, but whether they were broken deliberately and with intent to avoid detection. It's the difference between it being a cause for a slap on the wrist or a criminal matter, and you would think then a resigning matter. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion you end up with a resignation, even if you arguably should. The media will do their frenzy thing, as they did with Cummings last year. They're poised waiting. And the question will then be whether the voters still dismiss the issue as relatively unimportant, as they largely seem to do at the moment. Johnson might hope that he can continue to project the echoes of Donald Trump, with the ability to be held to a breached previously held standards and just to shrug and say, yeah, so what? And then you carry on regardless with your support hardly dented at all. But the UK parliamentary system is not the US presidential system. Carrie Simmons notwithstanding, there are limits to how far you can transgress before the system will assert some pretty powerful checks and balances. Meanwhile, in the US, President Joe Biden's State of the Union address showed that there are few echoes of Donald Trump left in the White House. We'll get to that and a roundup of some of the rest of the week's news in a minute. But first, I had a message from one of my Patreon supporters linking to a post on a climate skeptic blog and asking what I thought about it. And it turns out to be a long list of all of the memes. Headed, "Where is the climate emergency?" It was a series of graphs and charts, all designed to illustrate the incontrovertible case that all this climate stuff is nonsense. Now, most of them I'd seen before. Some of them are factually accurate, others are less so. Since this is a collection of all the nuggets that people clearly find the most persuasive, I thought it would be instructive to have a deep dive into it and work out what's true and what isn't. And what does it mean in any case? So there'll be mayhem in the comment section. Good times. Join me for that. Going live on Monday next week at 7 p.m. UK time. So, as I mentioned, there are few echoes of Donald Trump in the White House. Rather, there are echoes of Joe Biden. Addressing the American people, Biden promised to transform the economy, to rewrite the social compact and put Americans back to work. I'm referring to Biden's response to President Reagan's State of the Union address in 1983. Biden was then arguing in the face of the rising Reagan-Thatcher economic revolution for old-style big government traditional leftist values, and that's pretty much the definition of the programme that he put before the American people in his State of the Union address in 2021. With a proposed $6 trillion in additional spending, it was a return to the faith in big government, a return to the idea that the solution to problems is American unionised jobs. Climate change, that will surely be fixed by massive slabs of public sector cash, 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, all to be built by members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. The most successful recent model of rapid action, the vaccine development and rollout, seems not to have made a dent on this 20th century Democrat agenda, where you had the public sector taking on the risks that the market wouldn't touch, but then utilising the innovation and energy of the private sector to deliver. The question is whether in the 21st century, with the challenge of China, which Biden referred to a lot, a return to the old big government approach that was held to have failed in the past is now likely to succeed in the present. Well, sometimes it happens. An idea whose time had not yet come initially fails, but then blossoms when the circumstances change. Not sure that I've seen any coherent argument as to why that applies in this case. What's changed? It could be that a lot of this is just big programme posturing, knowing that half of it is going to fail to get through the House, but you're making a big, bold statement, gaining the applause from your base and setting up the opponents for the blame when it doesn't go through. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell certainly seems to suspect such motives. He said this: "Over a few short months, the Biden administration seems to have given up on selling actual unity in favour of catnip for their liberal base. It's not intuitive, but this is a winning strategy, and you can see that reflected in the country. Apparently, Joe Biden's approval rating at the end of his first 100 days is low, in the bottom 3 in history, according to a Washington Post ABC poll. Trump's was the actual lowest at 42% approval, then Gerald Ford at 48%, and then Biden at 52%. To put that into context, Barack Obama was on 69% at the same point, George W. Bush was at 63%. Does that mean Biden's a bad president? You will have your own opinions on that question, but it's too early to tell in any real sense. This rating isn't about him being a bad president, it's about him being a partisan president. All that stuff about Captain Unity was a bit of fluff before he started pushing huge spending bills and gun restrictions and let's talk about stacking the court and all the rest of it. I had to laugh at the BBC's take on this. On Wednesday they tweeted this: "What has US President Joe Biden achieved in his first 100 days in office? For many Americans, his slow but steady approach to governing is providing a welcome break from the non-stop drama of Donald Trump's presidency." Wait, what? Slow and steady? How many trillions would he be trying to spend if he was in a hurry? Oh, wait, you mean he doesn't tweet as much? Right. Got it. Meanwhile, some people have real problems. India has endured another week of crisis over the pandemic. Hospitals are completely swamped and are now turning large numbers of people away, meaning that families are trying desperately over social media to find sources of oxygen to try to keep their family members alive at home. Which means a black market in oxygen has sprung up, where people are being charged extortionate prices. According to the UK's Daily Telegraph, an oxygen cylinder that previously cost around £60 is now going for more like £1,000. Desperate families are also buying drugs such as remdesivir, which has a capped price of £19.50 but is selling for nearly £500. And that is a hefty price for false hope. Remdesivir is approved for use of COVID-19, but there's no evidence it's effective in improving survival rates. And that's if you even get what's been advertised. Because, of course, the scam merchants, well, they don't care that your parents are dying. Times like this, you see the very best unfortunately also the very worst in humanity. So in the western city of Pune, for instance, 4 people were arrested for passing liquid paracetamol off as remdesivir for desperate people. The twin problems with India are these. 1, it does not have good health infrastructure, while also having an extremely large population. So percentages of sick people that can be absorbed in wealthy countries with some difficulty, bear in mind, create a crisis. Hence hospitals running out of oxygen and turning people away. And 2, we don't have figures that bear any relation to the reality of what's happening on the ground. Now, I've seen some COVID skeptic YouTubers sharing this graph, suggesting that the situation is obviously all overblown. Except that is junk data. Some have estimated that the real daily death toll may be as much as 20 times higher in India. Now, we are of course very cautious of figures that are preceded by "some have estimated that," but you only have to assume that with a large population that's been living in high density situations and often not displaying much modifying behaviour for social distancing, it only has to be as bad as we have seen everywhere else, and you're pretty much into that ballpark. We're seeing footage now of bodies being burned in the streets because the crematoriums can't keep up. We're seeing police escorts for the oxygen cylinders protecting them from desperate people as they're taking them to the hospitals. And while Indian social media has been full of posts of people begging for help, as well as others advertising that there are beds in a certain location or there's oxygen, the Indian government, however, has been trying to actively cover up evidence of crisis, basically to limit the political damage to the government. In Uttar Pradesh, the state ruled by the man who's slated to be Prime Minister Modi's chosen successor, doctors have accused the state of understating deaths on a massive scale. One doctor working in the state's capital suggested that only 1 in every 20 COVID deaths are being officially recorded. You go anywhere, any locality, people are cremating or burying their dead. COVID deaths happening at home are not counted at all. This week, police prosecuted a man who tweeted the message, "Need oxygen cylinder ASAP," on the charge of making misleading statements. The government more widely has been censoring posts that are critical of the government response to the pandemic specifically. That doesn't seem to have gone too well. When just now I set my VPN to India and checked Twitter, #ResignModi and #IndiaChoked were both trending. Facebook apologised for removing posts with the #ResignModi at one point, saying it had been done so by mistake. Those wacky algorithms, they just have a mind of their own. Facebook's Supreme Court, the panel of outside experts appointed to rule on such cases, ordered the company to reinstate a post that accused the Prime Minister Modi of participating in efforts to kill the Sikh minority community. Various countries are now sending oxygen and ventilators and other support as well. But with vaccinations at just 10% of the population and a huge population at risk, this is going to be horrible for a while. Now, in a minute, we'll respond to a comment which morphs into the final thought for the week. But first, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison caused incredulity for some when he said what was obviously true, but which provokes mainstream commentators and the Twitterati to fury, which was that there was no evidence that race was a factor in the death of George Floyd. The rage was an echo of what we saw in the UK with the launch of the Sewell report, which found no evidence to the suggestion that the UK is riven with institutional racism. In my video on that report, I said that I'd found the data and the conclusions that it put forward to be credible and reasonable, and I'd struggled to find the factual foundations referred to by its critics. But one thing they do have a point on, of course, is that there is a history of race in the UK, and that has included the history of slavery and all of the rest of it, some dark times. Now, it's easy for the critics of the woke excesses of the identity politics crowd to rhetorically say, well, of course we all think that slavery was evil, but it's just not relevant to today's issues. And that is largely my position. But regular viewers of this channel will know that I like to challenge my position. and to look at the facts and see what the data actually tells us. So let's stare that evil in the face. I've been researching what is the real history, what it has meant over 2 centuries to be black and British, because the evidence matters. We shouldn't obsess about history, but we should know it. How much has that history really been defined by slavery? What do we learn from it if we go to it with an open mind? Well, I think there's some interesting and engaging insights in all of that, and of course, given the importance of the current discourse. So I'm going to be talking about that in the video to go live on this channel on Wednesday next week at 7 PM UK time. Join me then. This comment, in response to last week's roundup video, raised a topic I thought it would be interesting to talk to. And this is a longer segment than usual, and so it replaces the usual short thought slot at the end. Is Mallen, it's spelt with an E, I mean it's right there on the channel, sorry, getting distracted. Is Mallen sponsored by Big Pharma? His approach to the vaccine mania is pretty mainstream and not very critical. Maybe because it's not his area. It's a miracle, a vaccine for malaria. This comment only really implies it. I might be reading too much into it, but others in the past have more explicitly said it in the comment sections, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. It's the criticism of a position on the grounds that it is, quote, mainstream. Now, I have often criticised aspects of the mainstream media on this channel. Don't get me wrong. They have a business model that leads them to dramatise and to distort. Many of them present what they claim to be objective news content, while it's actually just disguised political propaganda. There's a healthy discourse calling out the mainstream media for its failings, and deservedly so. But there's also a tendency on YouTube for a lot of people to uncritically embrace alternative voices as self-evidently more credible. The implied criticism of this particular comment is that my position on vaccines is a bit mainstream, and therefore it must be clearly biased. As far as I'm concerned, I am always interested in critiques of the mainstream. I take outlier arguments seriously, and then look to see what the evidence is and whether those arguments are supported by that evidence. So, with the lockdown skeptics, I looked at some of the arguments there, looked at the research, and found that a number of them were good critiques, with at least a credible argument, and therefore worth considering. Some of them really weren't. On the vaccines, it has been much more clear. There have been clinical trials. These are amongst the most robust types of scientific studies you're going to get. We now have the real-world data from hundreds of millions of vaccinations across the world. The data supporting the efficacy of the vaccines, it's pretty robust. Does any of that mean that it makes sense when I see young people walking out on their own along quiet country lanes near to me wearing a mask? No. There's been some incredibly dumb messaging that's been going on that deserves robust criticism that is leading people to do things like that. Mainstream commentators have peddled absolute nonsense on some of the detail. But bear in mind, we now have a very creative community that wants to believe it has the inside track, that generally distrusts authority and kind of likes the attention. And between the various characters in that community, it is now the case that every single major world phenomenon or event that's going to happen from now on, and has happened recently, there is always going to be an alternative narrative suggesting that the mainstream version is just untrue and it's really much more nefarious than that. Every event. Now, we don't know what events are coming in the future, what the stories will be as to why we're being lied to, but I can still pretty much guarantee that those claims are going to be made. Every time. So, I'm not interested in roleplay. I'm not interested in whether a particular view is held by the mainstream or not. I'm interested in whether it's true. That applies to issues like transgender ideology stuff, where some of the orthodoxies are clearly lining up behind the magical thinking. That applies to some of the lockdown skeptic arguments, and indeed the climate skeptic arguments, where they have some validity and weight. And it applies to the areas where what is said in public is supported by the research, by the historical record, or whatever else it may be. A lot of the time, what's in the mainstream media is based on truth. Whether the competence or the bias of a journalist concerned does it justice or not. I mentioned just now the YouTube commenter I saw talking about COVID in India. After showing the graph suggesting that there's no big problem there according to the data, he showed this item with a note that the lead image in it was described as showing COVID in India but actually came from an unrelated event, which may have been true. The implication was that the description of what's happening, therefore, is all overblown. But if you take 2 seconds to look for them, there are multiple sources of information and evidence on this question. The majority of the photos with that article were from a named award-winning photojournalist who lives in India. You can go to his Twitter account and you can see him posting links to those photos and other accounts of what's happening as it's unfolding. Even if you suppose that all of the mainstream journalists and all the mainstream photographers on the ground are somehow choosing to make it all up. And that is a really surreal proposition, because why? But supposing you thought that could be the case, there are multiple other sources that naturally come with any event of this sort. It's too big to hide. You can see the people posting on Twitter with photos of bodies being burnt in the streets, video of people carrying the corpses of their loved ones on motorbikes, looking for cremation sites, lines of people with empty oxygen canisters getting them filled up, and all the tweets on Indian Twitter of people looking for help, as well as people advertising that there's a dozen ICU beds open in this location or there's oxygen available at the other location. There are lots of reasons to say that the chaos that's happening at the moment in India is no reason to be trying to frighten people in the UK or in Ireland or in the US, which was the point that this YouTuber was making. That point is true. But he was making it by implying that something for which there is overwhelming evidence simply isn't happening. That undermined his credibility as an authority to be trusted, as well as being pretty cold to the large numbers of people who are in serious trouble right now. Let's not worry about whether something is mainstream or not. Let's focus on what is or isn't true and see where that gets us. All right. Now, I don't know whether this video gets demonetized. Talking about horrible situations like what's going on in India means often that it does. My earlier videos on the explosion in Beirut were, for instance. But these things should be talked about. And I'm able to do that because of the Patreon supporters who frankly enable these videos to happen at all. The channel's still being choked by the algorithm of YouTube, so logically you'd think I'd be playing it safe at the moment, avoiding any issues that might prolong that situation of purdah. The whole point of doing these channels is to look at the issues that matter as they come up. So that support is hugely appreciated, utterly crucial to me being able to do this. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Do bear in mind, this video is being published on the last day of the month. Patreon takes your donations on the day that you sign up and then on the first of the month thereafter. So if you're watching this on Friday the 30th and you decide to sign up, thank you. You might want to wait until tomorrow so you're not accidentally making 2 contributions in rapid succession, unless that's what you want to do, of course. However you choose to time it, it is always appreciated, so thanks in advance. Have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.